Hey, warrior. 2,000 years before anyone wrote a single word about anger management, the Stoics had already mapped the entire battlefield. They did not study calm as an accident of personality. They studied it as a craft, the same way a blacksmith studies fire, the same way a sculptor studies stone. And at the center of everything they taught sat one discovery, repeated by every Stoic voice across 4 centuries in slightly different words. Between what happens to you and what you do about it, there is a space. That space is small. That space is also the entire territory where a human life is actually lived. Almost no one ever discovers this space exists. People live as though the insult and the outburst are the same event, fused together with no gap at all, as though a cruel word reaches the ear and a sharp reply leaves the mouth in a single unbroken motion, with nothing standing watch in between. The Stoics called this living like cattle, driven wherever the next provocation happened to push you. It is not an insult. It is simply an accurate description of a mind that has never been trained. Seneca said, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." That single sentence contains the whole of what follows. Delay is not weakness. Delay is not hesitation born of fear. Delay is the deliberate widening of that sacred space between trigger and response until it becomes wide enough to actually live inside, wide enough for reason to enter before the reaction does. This video walks through 5 ancient disciplines drawn directly from Stoic teaching, each one aimed at a different part of that same space. Not 5 clever tricks, 5 old, tested truths, carried forward across centuries because they have never once stopped working. By the end, you will understand exactly why some souls remain steady under provocation, and exactly what the ancients believed was missing in those who do not. None of these disciplines demand a crisis to practice. The Stoics themselves rarely trained on the great catastrophes of life. Those arrive too rarely and too suddenly to serve as a training ground. They trained instead on the small daily irritations, the slow servant, the rude stranger, the disappointing meal. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire, still found his patience tested by ordinary people doing ordinary, irritating things. And he wrote about it nightly, treating each irritation as a fresh chance to practice. This is one of the most overlooked truths in all of Stoic philosophy. The school is often remembered for its teachings on death, exile, and catastrophic loss, and those teachings are real and important. But the actual daily practice of Stoicism, the part that built the character capable of facing those greater trials, happened almost entirely in small, forgettable moments. A delayed letter, an unhelpful merchant, a disagreement with a friend over something trivial. The great trials test the character that small trials have already built. They do not build it themselves. You need not be perfect at any of this today. None of the Stoics were. Even Seneca, who wrote some of the wisest words ever recorded on anger, openly admitted to losing his own temper. The goal was never flawless composure. The goal was always the same, modest, patient aim. A little steadier this month than last, and steadier still the month after that. A particular kind of comfort lives inside this knowledge. The men whose words have outlasted empires were not born already wise. They failed at this constantly, in private, the same way anyone watching this video fails at it. What separated them was not the absence of failure, but the presence of a deliberate, lifelong practice aimed at narrowing the gap between knowing what is right and actually doing it. Type, "I train the gap," if you are ready to learn what the ancients knew about the space between trigger and reaction. The first teaching, the Stoics called it assent. The Stoics built an entire system around a single precise idea, and they gave it a precise name, assent. An impression arrives, a thought, a feeling, a sting, a flash of anger, All of it arrives uninvited, the way weather arrives. The Stoics never claimed a person could control this first arrival. What they claimed, and what they spent their entire philosophy proving, is that a person can control whether they give that impression their assent, whether they agree to let it become belief, and then become action. This is the hinge on which the whole of Stoic philosophy turns. The impression is not yours to choose, the assent is entirely yours. Between the two sits a gap most people never even notice exists, because they have never been taught to look for it. The untrained mind collapses impression and assent into a single motion. The insult arrives, and within the same breath, belief and action have already followed, with no examination ever taking place. Epictetus, who had been enslaved and beaten before he ever taught a single student, built his entire philosophy on this exact distinction. He had less control over his outward life than almost anyone in history, and from that position he discovered the one thing that could never be taken from him. Epictetus said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." Practice this the next time a sharp feeling arrives. Do not ask, "How do I make this feeling disappear?" Ask instead, "What is this impression, and do I choose to give it my assent?" Often the honest answer sounds like this: "This impression tells me I have been disrespected, and I do not assent to the belief that I must act on it instantly. The impression has been received. It has not yet been granted permission to become a verdict, nor an action." This single discipline, practiced again and again, dismantles a belief most people never think to question, that a strong impression automatically earns the right to instant, matching action. The Stoics denied this completely. A strong impression earns examination. What is done with it afterward remains a separate, sovereign choice, never surrendered the moment the impression arrives. The Stoics taught a simple exercise for strengthening this exact muscle. The moment an impression strikes, silently name it as an impression rather than as truth. Not, "I have been wronged," but an impression has arisen that tells me I have been wronged. This is not a trick of language for its own sake. It reflects something the Stoics held to be literally true. You are the one examining the impression, not the impression itself, no matter how convincingly it insists otherwise. This also explains an observation the Stoics made repeatedly about why some souls recover from a hard moment swiftly, while others carry the wound for days. The swift to recover are not suppressing the impression. They are simply granting it what it asked for in the first place, to be seen, rather than handing it command of every decision that follows. An impression that has been seen tends to settle. An impression that has been obeyed tends to multiply, drawing further impressions in its wake. Picture an ordinary moment. A driver cuts you off without warning. The impression strikes instantly. Heat, a hand reaching for the horn. Without the discipline of assent, all of it becomes action within a single breath, and the rest of the drive carries a low, bitter mood that bleeds into whatever comes next. With the discipline, the same impression arrives, is examined. There it is, sharp and immediate, and a separate, calm decision follows about what, if anything, truly needs to happen. Often the answer is nothing. The impression has been received. It was never granted command of the next 10 minutes of your life. The Stoics did not consider this discipline a denial of feeling. Epictetus himself never claimed a wise person feels nothing when struck by misfortune or insult. He claimed only that the wise person does not mistake the first jolt of feeling for a final verdict on what must be done about it. The untrained mind treats every strong impression as though it arrived already carrying its own instructions. The trained mind understands that the impression delivers only information, and the instructions, if any are needed at all, must still be written by reason. This teaching also explains something the Stoics observed about character over long stretches of time. A person who consistently grants instant assent to every passing impression slowly becomes unpredictable even to themselves, governed by whichever feeling happens to arrive loudest on a given day. A person who practices withholding assent, even imperfectly, begins to notice a strange steadiness settling into their own character. Not because the impressions stopped arriving, but because the impressions stopped being mistaken for commands. A useful distinction is worth holding on to here, one the Stoics themselves drew carefully. Withholding assent is not the same as denying that an impression exists, nor pretending it carries no weight. Epictetus was once asked whether grief itself was wrong, and his answer was more nuanced than people often assume. The first tears, the first surge of sorrow, he considered involuntary and entirely human. What concerned him was the assent that followed, the decision made afterward to dwell in despair indefinitely, to let the involuntary first wave become a chosen, prolonged condition rather than a passing storm that was allowed to pass. This same wisdom applies to anger as readily as it applies to grief. The first spark is not the failure. The failure, if one occurs, lives entirely in what happens after the spark, whether it is examined and allowed to pass, or fed and allowed to grow into something that governs the rest of the day. Comment, I withhold my assent if you just understood for the first time that a feeling and a belief are not the same thing. The second teaching, what disturbs you is never the event itself. Epictetus opened his most famous teaching with a sentence so simple, it is easy to walk past without ever absorbing its weight. Men are disturbed not by events, but by the opinions they hold about events. This is not a comforting platitude. It is a precise, almost clinical diagnosis of where suffering actually originates, and it places the entire matter uncomfortably in the hands of the one suffering. This means the flash of rage at a careless comment this morning was very likely never truly about the comment at all. It was about an opinion attached to it within the same instant, an opinion built, quietly, from every similar moment that came before. Stretching back through years, the comment itself had nothing to do with. This morning's words were merely the latest voice in an old chorus, and the reaction carried the full weight of every voice that sang before it, though only one voice was actually present in the room. Marcus Aurelius said, "Confine yourself to the present moment, and you'll find that the thought troubling you is rarely about anything happening right now at all." This is precisely what the Stoics meant when they separated the event from the opinion held about it. The mind, in a moment of disproportionate suffering, is not truly responding to what just occurred. It is responding to an entire accumulated history of similar moments, all rising together, disguised as one overreaction to one small thing. Once this teaching is understood, the work transforms entirely. Instead of asking, why am I so disturbed by something so small, the Stoic question becomes, what opinion have I attached to this event? And is that opinion actually true? Sometimes the answer surfaces at once. A parent who dismissed you this exact way, a friend who broke faith this exact way. Sometimes the answer takes longer to uncover. Either way, the asking accomplishes something the Stoics considered essential. It separates the size of the disturbance from the size of the actual event, which is, more often than not, the entire root of the suffering. A simple test is worth applying the next time a disturbance feels larger than its cause. Ask whether the weight of the feeling actually matches what occurred, judged as plainly as the Stoics insisted all things be judged. A reply delayed 6 hours does not, on its own, typically earn enough dread to ruin an entire evening. When the measure does not balance, when the disturbance plainly outweighs the event, that imbalance is almost always where an old opinion is hiding, lending weight the present moment never earned on its own. The Stoics taught that a person standing before you today deserves to be judged for what they have actually done, not for what another soul did to you long ago. Failing to make this distinction means responding to a ghost rather than to the living person in front of you. A new companion gets treated, without anyone intending it, like the one who once betrayed trust. A new colleague gets treated like the one who once claimed credit unjustly. The opinion formed long ago quietly attaches itself to someone who had no part in forming it. Think of a simple family dinner. Someone offers a light joke about a messy kitchen. For most people, the comment passes through harmlessly and vanishes within seconds. But for someone shaped by years of constant criticism, that same small joke can suddenly feel like an indictment of their entire character, and the reaction that follows arrives wildly out of proportion to one small joke at the table. The Stoics would say plainly, the joke did not disturb you. Your opinion about the joke disturbed you, and that opinion was built somewhere else, long before tonight. Epictetus pressed this teaching even further than most modern readers expect. He argued that even death itself, the event most people consider the worst possible thing that could happen, is not actually terrible in itself. What is terrible, he insisted, is the opinion that death is terrible. This claim sounds almost shocking stated plainly, yet it is simply the same principle applied to its furthest extreme. If even death is governed by opinion rather than by the bare fact of the event, then surely a delayed reply, a careless comment, or a missed greeting falls easily within the same territory. This teaching does not ask anyone to deny that genuine harms exist in the world, and the Stoics were careful never to claim otherwise. A real betrayal is a real betrayal. A real injustice is a real injustice. What the Stoics insisted upon was something narrower and, in its own way, more demanding, that the suffering attached to these events is rarely proportional to the events themselves, and that the gap between the two is almost always filled by opinion rather than by fact. Closing that gap does not erase the wrong. It simply prevents the wrong from being multiplied indefinitely by a mind that keeps adding interest to an old debt. This does not make today's event unimportant. It makes the response to it true rather than inflated. A real boundary can still be set. A real conversation can still take place. But now it is measured against what actually happened today, rather than carrying the unpaid debt of an opinion formed somewhere else entirely. Something quietly freeing arrives the moment you finally understand why certain small moments wound far more deeply than they should. It is not a flaw of character in the Stoic view. It is simply an old, unexamined opinion reasserting itself whenever life brushes against the same place. Examine the opinion honestly, and it loses much of its power. The same way Epictetus taught that any disturbance, once traced back to the actual opinion creating it, can be questioned and very often dissolved. This examination is not a single act performed once and forgotten. The Stoics treated it as a recurring discipline, returned to again and again across an entire lifetime, because old opinions rarely surrender after only one honest look. They tend to retreat, then return, slightly weaker each time they are examined, until eventually they no longer arrive with the same automatic force they once carried. Drop "I examine my opinion" below if you just realized today's reaction was carrying the weight of an old belief, not today's event. The third teaching. Speak as the wise are said to speak. The Stoics paid close attention not only to what was said under pressure, but to how it was said, and they considered this no small matter. Seneca, writing directly on the subject of anger, observed that the angry voice betrays its owner before a single accusation is even understood. The pitch rises, the words come faster. The body itself begins to behave as though under attack, regardless of whether any real danger exists at all. Seneca said, Speak rarely, but say much. This single line carries an entire discipline within it. The wise do not speak less because they have less to say. They speak less because they have learned that a flood of words, delivered quickly and loudly, rarely persuades anyone of anything. A few words delivered slowly and with weight tend to land where many words simply scatter. The Stoics believed that a calm, measured voice was not merely a courtesy extended to others, it was evidence, visible to anyone listening, that reason still governed the speaker. The Stoics understood something about the relationship between body and judgment centuries before anyone studied it formally. A racing voice and shallow breath feed a racing mind, each one accelerating the other. A slow, low voice and a deepened breath do the opposite. They signal to the body that no true emergency exists, and the body, more often than the mind expects, tends to believe the signal and settle accordingly. Practice this the next time tension begins to rise. Choose deliberately to lower your voice rather than raise it. Choose a plain, unhurried sentence. Let us slow down for a moment, or I want to understand this fully before I respond. The Stoics would say the words themselves matter less than the spirit carrying them. A calm voice, even delivering a firm truth, tends to settle a room. A raised voice, even delivering a fair point, tends to ignite one. This same principle, the Stoics believed, extends to written words as well, though they themselves wrote with pen and parchment rather than glowing screens. Short, sharp phrasing reads as agitation no matter the century. Longer, unhurried sentences read as steadiness, even while addressing something genuinely difficult. Choosing to write slowly during a tense exchange does in writing what a lowered voice does in speech. It reveals through form alone that reason still holds the pen. A further reason the Stoics valued the calm voice is easily overlooked. A measured voice forces the listener to attend more closely, simply because it offers nothing to react against except the actual meaning of the words. A raised voice gives the listener an excuse to grow defensive without ever engaging the substance of what was said. Remove that excuse, and what remains is, more often than not, an honest exchange neither side expected when the conversation began. Practice this somewhere the stakes are small before relying on it where the stakes are great. Speak a single ordinary sentence today more slowly than feels natural, and notice what changes in how it is received. The Stoics trained virtue the same way any craft is trained, in small repetitions, on ordinary days, long before the great test ever arrives. A deeper reason explains why the Stoics cared so much about the manner of speech, beyond its effect on others. They believed the way a person speaks under pressure reveals, more honestly than almost anything else, whether reason or passion currently governs that person's soul. A philosopher could claim great wisdom in calm conditions and reveal nothing true about their actual character. It was only under provocation, when the voice was tested, that the real state of the soul became visible to others, and more importantly, to the person speaking. This is why Seneca treated the angry voice not as a minor flaw of manner, but as direct evidence of a mind temporarily overtaken. He observed that anger, more than any other passion, disguises itself as strength while it operates, convincing the angry person that their raised voice is righteous force, rather than a loss of the very governance the Stoics prized above almost everything else. Seneca went further still, writing an entire treatise on anger in which he described it as a brief madness, a temporary loss of reason that feels while it lasts, exactly like clarity and conviction. This is precisely what makes anger so dangerous in his view. It does not announce itself as weakness. It dresses itself as righteous certainty, and only afterward, once the voice has settled and the words can no longer be unsaid, does the mind recognize what actually happened in that moment. This particular discipline tends to reveal progress more quickly than the others, and for good reason. The voice is immediate and audible, impossible to hide from oneself the way an internal thought sometimes can be. A person who has practiced this for even a few weeks often notices, almost with surprise, the exact instant their own voice begins to rise. A kind of self-awareness the Stoics considered essential, and one that simply was not available before the practice began. Type, "I speak with a measured voice," if you are ready to practice this the next time tension arrives uninvited. The fourth teaching: suspend judgment until it is earned. The Stoics drew a careful line between perceiving something and judging it, and they considered the gap between those two acts to be sacred ground, worth defending fiercely. To perceive an event is simply to register that it occurred. To judge it is to attach meaning, motive, and consequence. And the Stoics warned again and again that judgment rushed into being before the evidence has arrived is judgment built on nothing but discomfort. Marcus Aurelius said, "Waste no more time arguing what a good person should be one." A quieter teaching sits beside that one throughout his private writings. Waste no more time forcing a verdict before the evidence has actually shown itself. Most painful overreactions, examined honestly, trace back to exactly this failure. An unclear situation was transformed into a confident, dark judgment within seconds, and everything that followed was built upon a verdict never once tested against reality. The discipline lies in noticing the precise instant a judgment tries to form before enough is truly known. A friend has not replied in 6 hours. The judgment eager to form might whisper they are avoiding me or I have done something wrong. The honest Stoic position at 6 hours is simply this is not yet known, a position almost no one finds comfortable to inhabit, which is exactly why most abandon it within seconds in favor of any judgment at all, because a painful certainty feels lighter to carry than an open question. The Stoics taught that suspending judgment is not the same as refusing to ever judge. It means reaching a conclusion only once there is genuinely enough to support it, rather than the instant the discomfort of not knowing becomes unbearable. This single distinction, properly understood, prevents an enormous share of the suffering most people accept as simply part of being human. A true cost deserves naming here, one almost no one calculates while rushing toward false comfort. Every hasty judgment must eventually be unwound, often at a far steeper price than patience would ever have demanded. An accusation built upon an incomplete picture must be undone once the full truth arrives. A friendship withdrawn over a misread signal must be mended, if it can be mended at all, once the honest explanation finally surfaces. A simple phrase worth keeping close in the Stoic spirit is this: "I do not know yet, and that is enough for now." Spoken silently, even once, it interrupts the rush toward judgment long enough to ask whether that judgment truly rests upon anything real, or whether it is merely the fastest story available, seized to fill an uncomfortable silence. Here is a small, ordinary moment the Stoics would have recognized at once, though they never owned a telephone. A friend reads a message and does not reply for the rest of the day. By evening, an entire judgment has formed. Perhaps they are upset. Perhaps the friendship is fading. By morning, the true reason proves entirely ordinary. None of it had anything to do with you at all. An entire evening was spent defending against a judgment that was never even true, simply because the open question felt unbearable to sit with for a few more hours. The Stoics would offer a simple law here. Whenever a silence is filled with the worst possible judgment, pause and ask whether a far more ordinary explanation sits quietly beside it. There almost always is one. Ordinary explanations rarely command the same attention as dramatic ones, yet they are right far more often, and granting them a fair hearing spares an enormous weight of needless suffering. The Stoics also taught that suspended judgment was not merely a private comfort, but a form of justice owed to others. To judge a person's motives before the evidence has arrived is, in a quiet way, a kind of theft, claiming to know something about another soul that has not actually been earned through honest observation. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about extending this same patience to the people around him, reminding himself that most who wronged him did so out of confusion rather than true malice, and that a hasty judgment robbed them of a fairness he would have wanted for himself. This extends, in Marcus Aurelius's own writing, to a striking degree of generosity toward people who genuinely had wronged him. He reminded himself, repeatedly, that those who act badly usually do so because they cannot see clearly, not because they have chosen cruelty with full understanding of what they were doing. This was not naivety on his part. It was a deliberate discipline, practiced because he understood that a mind quick to assume the worst of others tends, over time, to become a mind that suffers the worst, regardless of what those around it actually intended. This teaching does not require believing that everyone is secretly good, which the Stoics themselves never claimed. It requires only the patience to find out which kind of person stands before you, rather than deciding in advance and treating the verdict as already settled before the evidence has had any real chance to speak. Comment: I suspend my judgment if you have caught yourself rushing toward a verdict that later proved false. The fifth teaching: meet the day already prepared for friction. Marcus Aurelius opened many of his private mornings the same way, and the opening line still startles modern readers the first time they encounter it. He reminded himself before his feet even touched the floor that the people he would deal with that day would be meddling, ungrateful, dishonest, jealous, and difficult. This was not bitterness toward the world. It was a deliberate act of preparation, performed for one reason alone, so that when the friction actually arrived, it would meet a mind that was already braced for it, rather than a mind caught completely by surprise. This single habit explains, more than almost any other Stoic teaching, why some souls seem to absorb provocation without ever being shaken by it. The untrained mind treats every irritation as an ambush, a sudden insult against an expectation that the day was supposed to run smoothly. The trained mind has already expected friction before it arrived, and an expected disturbance carries only a fraction of the force that an unexpected one carries. Surprise, more than the provocation itself, is often what produces the fast, regrettable reaction. Marcus Aurelius said, "Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful, yet none of this can touch what is truly mine." This morning preparation was never meant to breed cynicism or distrust of others. Marcus Aurelius governed with remarkable patience and is remembered, even by his harshest critics, as unusually gentle for a man with absolute power over an empire. The preparation served the opposite purpose entirely. By expecting difficulty in advance, he freed himself to meet actual difficulty with curiosity rather than outrage, because the outrage had already been spent quietly before breakfast on a difficulty that had not even arrived yet. There is real value in trying this exercise honestly, just once, before a day that seems likely to test your patience. Spend a few unhurried moments naming, specifically, the kind of friction most likely to appear. A curt reply, a missed deadline, a careless word from someone close to you. Picture it arriving. Picture yourself meeting it calmly, already informed that it was coming, rather than blindsided by it. This is not pessimism. It is closer to a soldier checking their own readiness before stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Seneca extended this same practice toward larger trials, not only the small irritations of an ordinary morning. He counseled rehearsing loss, rehearsing hardship, rehearsing the worst a single day could bring, precisely so that none of it, should it ever arrive, would find the mind defenseless. Fortune, he wrote, strikes hardest at those who expected nothing but ease. The Stoics aimed to be struck by nothing they had not already considered in advance, even briefly, even imperfectly. This teaching connects directly back to the very first lesson of this video. A mind ambushed by surprise has no time to examine its own impressions before granting them assent. A mind already prepared for friction meets that same impression with far less force behind it, which makes every other discipline in this video considerably easier to practice when the actual test finally arrives. Consider how differently a single delayed flight lands on two different travelers. One expected smooth, uninterrupted travel and feels personally wronged the moment the delay is announced, as though the universe owed them an apology. The other expected, in some quiet corner of their mind, that travel involves friction as a matter of course, and the same delay registers simply as the friction they had already accounted for. Nothing about the delay itself changed between the two travelers. Only the preparation did, and that preparation alone determined whether the next hour was spent in quiet patience or in mounting fury. None of this requires gloom or constant vigilance against imagined disaster. A few unhurried minutes each morning naming what kind of friction the day might bring is enough. The aim is modest, not to predict the future with any accuracy, but simply to remove the element of surprise from ordinary human difficulty so that patience never has to be assembled from nothing in the heat of an actual provocation. Last one, type, I prepare for the friction ahead, and choose tomorrow morning as the morning you truly begin. 5 ancient teachings. Withholding assent until reason has examined the impression, tracing a disturbance back to the opinion that actually created it, not the event itself. Speaking with a measured voice, so reason rather than alarm holds the word. Suspending judgment until the evidence has truly arrived. And meeting each day already prepared for friction, the way Marcus Aurelius prepared himself each morning, so that provocation never lands as ambush, but as something already expected and already met with composure. None of this asks you to become someone else. The fear, the anger, the sting of betrayal, none of it vanishes, and the Stoics never claimed it would. What changes is what unfolds in the small space between the impression and the reply. That space is narrow. Yet the Stoics insisted it is nearly the entire territory in which a human life and a human character are actually decided, one moment at a time, across an entire lifetime. The Stoics never believed a person could choose what befalls them. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire through plague and war, and still could not choose those things. What every Stoic from Zeno to Seneca to Epictetus to Marcus Aurelius insisted upon across 4 centuries and radically different circumstances was this: the response remains entirely yours, in every circumstance without exception. Pause for a moment on the sheer span of time that idea has survived. Zeno first taught it in a painted porch in Athens, centuries before Rome had risen to its height. Epictetus taught it from a position of literal enslavement. Marcus Aurelius taught it to himself, privately, while commanding the most powerful army in the known world. 3 radically different lives, 3 radically different stations, and one identical conviction passed faithfully between them: that the space between event and response belongs, in every single case, entirely to the one standing inside it. You were not born with this strength. Neither was any Stoic who taught it. It was built, the same 5 teachings, practiced upon the same small, forgettable moments that arrive constantly and matter to almost no one except the soul deciding in that very instant who they intend to be inside them. A particular kind of confidence arises only from this kind of training, one the Stoics named ataraxia, an untroubled steadiness that does not depend on circumstances going well. It is not the confidence of believing nothing will ever go wrong. It is the steadier confidence of knowing that whatever does go wrong, a trained and examined response already waits to meet it. Choose the teaching that struck you hardest while listening. That is the one your life is asking you to train first. Practice it this week upon something small enough that failure costs almost nothing, so that when something truly difficult arrives, the teaching already feels familiar rather than attempted for the first time under real pressure. A full year of this practice looks from a distance almost unremarkable, the way Stoic philosophy itself often looks unremarkable to those who have never tried to actually live it. Lived day by day, up close, it looks like something else entirely. An argument that never happened, a friendship that survived a misunderstanding, a version of you that others, without ever knowing the discipline behind it, simply begin to call unshakable. This is, in the end, what the ancients actually meant by wisdom. Not a vast collection of facts about the universe, but a settled, practiced mastery over the small space between what happens and what is done about it. Every Stoic text that survives, across centuries of war, fire, and loss, points back toward this same narrow ground, because the ancients understood something modern life still struggles to accept. There is no larger battlefield available to any human being than their own response to what life brings them. Consider how strange it is that these words have survived at all. Empires that once seemed permanent have crumbled into ruin. Languages that once filled entire continents have gone silent. And yet a handful of letters written by a Roman philosopher to a friend, a private journal never meant for publication, a series of lectures recorded by a student. These fragments have outlasted nearly everything else from their era, because the problem they addressed has never once stopped being the central problem of human life. Every generation rediscovers the same narrow gap between provocation and response, and every generation must learn, as if for the first time, that the gap is where freedom actually lives. You need no perfect week to begin. You need only a single moment today in which an impression is examined before it is obeyed. That is the whole of the beginning. Everything else is built slowly, faithfully, the same way it was built by every Stoic who came before you. If this reached you exactly when you needed it, hit that like button, leave a comment with the teaching you are choosing to begin with, and send this to the one soul in your life who could use a longer pause between provocation and reply. Subscribe for more ancient wisdom made practical for the life you're actually living. And remember, the calmest person in any room is very often the one who studied the oldest teachings the most carefully.